All right, folks, it's been a couple of days since the incident in Jordan at, I believe it was called Tower 11, right across the border from the Al-Tanf base, illegally inside of Syria. I think I talked about it, enough. The first time I addressed this issue on Monday, and ever since, all of OSINT Twitter, the warmongers that they are, have been just lighting up the switchboard with all sorts of tweets about how they're anticipating a U.S. response anytime now. And I've been seeing OSINT accounts, chiding Biden for looking weak. Because, Biden, he's trying to be so careful and not start a war. F the mullahs. Iran must go. And keep in mind, a lot of these OSINT accounts are Israeli. If they're not American. That's kind of the irony here. It's like, you've got Israel and America, again, controlling all the information. I think that the day even though I still look to them because there aren't too many great independent sources of information, they're still somewhat useful because they do scour social media looking for some stuff. But again, only things to support their narrative. The the day that I saw Marco Rubio tweeting out a thank you to all of the OSINT accounts on Twitter, that was when it became perfectly clear. It's like, oh wait, these guys aren't just like they're not useful idiots, even though I hate that term. I think it's very degrading. But I should say they're not just true believers. They're not just, these are people who happen to believe every single lie put it forth by the CIA and other Western intelligence organizations. These guys are just straight up captured. They are mouthpieces. And so what I see with all of their cheerleading for a war with Iran, to me, that is a proxy for the sentiment within the intelligence community. It seems to me that the spooks want to take on Iran, and certainly the defense contractors. I mean, they want that more than anything. Because a war with Iran would be the biggest and baddest and most destructive war since World War II. The Biden administration, however, is not biting. They seem to be looking for an out like Trump took way back when he was president, and I was very tough on Trump with respect to his policy towards Iran. I thought the assassination of Soleimani was an outrageous escalation. Soleimani was one of the most important commanders in the war against ISIS, which the U.S. created. Eventually, under Trump, the U.S. did turn on ISIS and help defeat them. But it was Syria, Iran, and Russia who were fighting ISIS the entire time. And so Soleimani was a hero to a lot of the better people in the Middle East. The real bad guys who supported ISIS, they didn't like Soleimani. They hated him. A lot of the good people, on the other hand, really liked him for what he did. And so by assassinating him, the U.S. is again putting itself on the opposite side of the civilized population of the Middle East and positioning itself squarely on the side of the Al-Qaeda types. I mean, there's no other way to put it. And so Iran had to respond to that because it was a humiliation for their country. And they launched a bunch of missiles at an empty U.S. base. And Trump essentially let that be the end of that. And so now we have an opposite situation where even though Iran, we're told by the White House themselves or by the Pentagon, Iran did not commit this attack against the American invaders who were stationed on the border with Syria, positioned for cross-border raids. Those 3 Americans, by all accounts, were killed by Iraqis, it would seem, at this point. That's not confirmed, but most people keep pointing to Kataib. I always screw up the name. Kataib al-Hezbollah, which is Iraqi Hezbollah. And so it's not like the IRGC killed these three people. But nevertheless, that is the narrative. And so Biden is looking for an out. He's looking for something that he can do to show that, oh, I stood up and I struck back against Iran because there is somehow we have this ridiculous narrative that would only exist in the United States. You go anywhere else in the world, this narrative does not exist. Everyone else would understand that this is absurd and that the U.S. are the ones who invaded the Middle East decades ago, and therefore any attack on American soldiers in the Middle East is not like that's not just, oh, some Americans were minding their own business and they got attacked in the Middle East. It's like, no, they were there. Their very presence is an act of aggression. What the U.S. has been doing for decades has been committing acts of aggression against every person in the Middle East. There is no one who, at one point or another, has not found themselves on the wrong end of American bayonets and missiles. Every faction has been an enemy or an ally at one point or another. So now Biden is being chided for being weak. That's the best they can do. That's the problem with Biden. Yeah, it's that he's weak. Everything wrong with the Biden administration, this is what people choose to hone in on. That he doesn't want to go to war with Iran. Which is kind of uncharacteristic for him because historically Biden was one of the biggest hawks in Washington. After all, if it weren't for Biden ramming through the Iraq war authorization in the Senate, there probably would have been no Iraq war. Or another way of putting that, if Biden had opposed the Iraq war, he was in the best position possible to stop it. I believe he was chair of Armed Services, and if it wasn't Armed Services, it was something. Something similar. It was one of those. I can't remember exactly at this point. Again, this has been over 20 years now at this point. But perhaps in his old age and in his dementia, Biden has softened a bit, and he says, you know what? Does it really make sense to send tens of thousands of Americans over to die in Iran? No, probably doesn't. So let's try and avoid that. But that's not good enough because the warmongers want blood. And they will accept no substitutions. And so assuming that Biden takes the same route as Trump and comes to some sort of, backdoor agreement with the Iranians, hey, let us blow something up that doesn't matter, some building that's empty, that has nobody in it, and let's call that even. And then we can just forget about this and go about the rest of the year. It's an election year. I don't want to invade Persia. Historically, that hasn't worked out great for empires in the past. The Persian Empire is an ancient society that has existed for thousands of years because it has strong natural borders. It's not the easiest place to invade. It's not like it's a flat sandbox with completely artificial borders like Iraq. You go to try and invade Iran, you have to climb over mountains to get into the country. You have to climb straight up onto the Iranian plateau, and then you have to march to Tehran, which is very far away. You ever looked at a map, the size comparison? You look at Lebanon. Oh, yeah, we all know Lebanon and Israel, they're pretty tiny countries, And Israel and Lebanon, they're next to Jordan and Syria. And we think, oh, Jordan and Syria, they're bigger countries. Until you look a little bit east and you see Iraq. You go, oh, wow, Iraq? No, Iraq's a big country. Syria's pretty, not that big. Syria's a sort of smallish country. And then you zoom out and look at Iran. Iran is absolutely massive. It's like 10 times the size of Iraq. And Iraq, like I said, didn't have natural borders. It was completely flat. It was just a big sandbox for the U.S. military to go play in. And even that was an unwinnable war. The U.S. was unable to defeat an insurgency movement inside a country that was completely open and had pretty much no cover. In fact, it was the most, the most desert area. Gosh, I can't even remember it now. It's the Western Anbar. That's what it was. It's been so long since we talked about the Iraq War. Anbar province, that's where the Sunni insurgency was strongest, I believe. That's where, that's where the fighting really was, the most intense. That's the most desertified. There's nothing there. Absolutely nothing. It's worthless. I mean, even the oil, I don't believe there's oil in Anbar. All the oil is, down south by Kuwait. In fact, Joe Biden actually had a pretty decent idea back in the day to balkanize Iraq, although this is getting off topic at this point, but would have made the war a little bit more winnable. They said, okay, let's just concede the South is ruled by the Shia. We're just going to have to pawn that off, give it to Iran. But then let's give the Sunnis in the West and the Kurds in the North their own states. And then maybe that would have created an Iraq that was a little more stable. But at this point, who cares? Ancient history. It's not like the United States will ever learn from past mistakes, whether that mistake is the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. Honestly, I don't know enough about... I don't have an informed enough opinion about Korea to tell you what's wrong with Korea. I'm sure there's plenty you can find. I've never studied Korea very closely. It's called the Forgotten War for a reason. But anyway, moving on to the next mistake, Vietnam. The Second Gulf War, also known as the First Iraq War. The Second Iraq War. The war in Afghanistan. The war in Yemen. The war in Somalia. The war in Libya. The war in Syria. And soon to be the war in Iran. That is, if any of these deranged lunatics have anything to say about it. But anyway, it's a strange position to be in. My read is that Biden is on the right track here. Or whoever's controlling Biden. Whoever is, whoever's pulling the strings on the marionette, they seem to be trying to avoid war with Iran, and that's something I 100% support. Are they doing the right thing? No, they're not pulling the troops out of the Middle East. They're not fixing anything else. But hey, if they at least don't make the worst mistake in modern American history by starting a war with Iran, that's at least one thing I can praise them for. And you know what, on Monday, I think I said the next time I came back, I would try and address why a war with Iran would be such a disaster, which I've talked about before. I talked about it quite a bit when Trump was flirting with war in Iran. And maybe I'll do a full, how full can 10 minutes really be? Just giving a brief overview of why Iran is so terrible. But the main thing I already talked about is it's the terrain. No pun intended, terrain, Tehran. It's massive. It's just too much to occupy. The people there would never accept a U.S.-imposed regime. If we go in there and try to reinstall Prince Reza Pahlavi as the Shah of Iran, that's not going to work this time. I think everyone knows that. Anyone who's a moderately serious person, I mean, what is the plan? I would love to listen to Lindsey Graham, whatever nonsense he comes up with. Okay, you go into Iran. Let's say you can make it all the way to Tehran somehow and defeat the resistance. What's next? I'll tell you, they'll just never get that far because the insurgency in Iran will be stronger and more unified than in any of the countries, I think, that the U.S. has invaded in recent years, because Iran is an actual nation-state, unlike Syria or Iraq or Libya. Persian civilization goes back thousands of years. They have a consistent through line. And so I think that the best that the U.S. will be able to do is, destabilize some areas that are dominated by ethnic minorities on the frontiers of the Persian Empire. But here I am getting way off into a topic that should be saved for another day. So with that said, I will see you folks back here in the next one.